This presentation will help you review for the final grammar exam. There'll be 10 questions and they're each worth 5 points. First, we'll begin with the comma splice. This occurs when you take two complete sentences and you join it with only a comma. And you can see some examples here. Mary ran, John walked. That's two sentences, and if you put in a conjunction, you can make it one sentence. Mary ran, comma, but John walked. You could also use a semicolon, but this is a very formal way of writing. You would only do that in the real world if you were probably in school or working for a publishing company. You could also make one clause independent. Although Mary ran, comma, John walked. Here's a sentence with an error in it. The car is red, it can't be sold. If you put in but it can't be sold and you have the comma, it works. Now the run-on sentence is very similar to the comma splice. You just didn't bother to put the comma in. So the corrections are very similar. Because Carol talked, comma, David listened. Carol talked, comma, and David listened. Here's the red car example. This time around, see, there's no comma between red and it, and you could easily just make it two sentences, or you could say, although the car is red, comma, it can't be sold. Perhaps it belongs to the owner of the dealership, something like that. Now, sentence fragments occur when you have a group of words that you treat as a complete sentence, but it will lack a subject, a predicate, or it may begin with a subordinating word such as although or because or while. And there's different types of these fragments. One common thing is the phrase fragment. Should you vote? Of course. Now that could slip into your writing if you're asking questions. There's the dependent clause fragment. Because his friends voted, period, the candidate won the election. So you can easily just combine that. Voted, comma, the candidate. Now the sentence fragment with the car in it, although the car is red, comma, it can't be sold. Usually when you have these phrase fragments, you just look and see, does it go with the sentence before or the sentence after? A pronoun agreement error occurs when there's an inconsistent match between the person, the number, and or the gender, between the pronoun and its antecedent. The antecedent just means the word to which the pronoun refers. So everyone should read their books. Now it may sound strange, but everyone is singular, as is everybody, anybody, somebody. All those indefinite singular pronouns need to have his or her. However, it's usually better to get a more definite noun. Students should read their books. This time around you have an S on students, so you use their. You can also have an ambiguous pronoun reference, and that means that you're not clear to which noun you're referring. Here's an example. She lost the calculator and pen, but she found it. Well, did she find the calculator and pen, or did she find just one, or both? You need to rework that sentence. The dangling modifiers are probably one of the more difficult errors to detect because it sounds so logical to the writer. You know what you're referring to, but the modifier can't perform the action in the noun. Here's the way. There's no noun or pronoun capable of performing the action in that modifier. So this is a little tricky. Let's take a look at this. Using this drug, comma, side effects are experienced. Well, who's using the drug? The side effects. That doesn't make sense. So you usually, to correct this, have to put in a subject. Using this drug, comma, patients experience side effects. Now be careful with this one. This is tricky, and I'll give you a little hint. One of the questions on the final exam uses this. So look at this again. Using this drug, who's experiencing the side effects? The side effects are experiencing the side effects. That's not logical. So let's revise it. Using this drug, comma, patients experience side effects. As written, the drug is experiencing the side effects, so you need a logical subject capable of using that drug. You have to put it right next to that modifier. And as I mentioned, this one is difficult to detect. So you have to, look at your sentences. When you have those modifiers, look next to it. If you've got something like, using this drug, it's important to note that side effects could be experienced. No, you can't do that. Misplaced modifiers are a little bit easier, I think, to detect. You just have to move the words around. You don't have to necessarily add the words. Flying overhead, the citizens of Metropolis saw Superman. Who is doing the flying? The citizens. So let's move it around. The citizens of Metropolis saw Superman flying overhead. Now, comma errors, this is what you make the most of. I would say comma errors and apostrophes are probably the worst offenders in almost anyone's writing. And it's simple because there's so many different rules for the commas especially, but also the apostrophes. So let's look at a definition. A sentence containing a misplaced or unnecessary comma or not containing a comma that is required. So either you put one in the wrong place, or you didn't need it, or you forgot to put it in. Those are the three ways that we get those. Now here's a common one. If you have an introductory element, that simply means the words that go in the front of the sentence before you get to the main subject and verb. So here's your introductory element. When I drive to the airport, I use the expressway. Take a look at the correction. Isn't it easier to read that sentence when you separate the introductory clause and the main clause? When I drive to the airport, comma, I use the expressway. An introductory element, whether it's an independent or dependent clause or a phrase or a word, is usually set off from the rest of the sentence by a comma. Now, if you need help remembering what's a dependent clause and what's a phrase and what's a word, what's an independent clause, remember we studied that in weeks 1 and 2. So just go back and take a look at the week 1 and 2 folder and look at the grammar attachment. Now here's some types of comma errors. You set off items in a series. This is important, for example, with the dates and the addresses, but you could also set it off with, if I go to the store, comma, I will buy apples, comma, pears, comma, and peaches. That's a series. Okay, setting off non-essential and non-restrictive material. Now what specifically does that mean? It means that if you don't need those words, you can put them in commas. I like to think of it this way. They're set off by commas, and I could take the 2 commas and all the words in between and just yank them out of the sentence and throw them out the window because I don't need it. The sentence makes sense without it. Those words are not essential. So if I said Jimmy Smith, comma, the man wearing the red tie, comma, is at work today. We don't really need to know about his red tie because we have the name, Jimmy Smith. Now let's use one where the words are essential. The man with the gun is robbing the bank. Which man is robbing the bank? Oh, it's the man with the gun. With the gun is essential, so there's no commas. Now sometimes this is a judgment call. The important thing is if you separate it on one side, separate it on the other, because a lot of times your reader's not going to sit there and think, well, was this really necessary or not? But if there's only one comma in the beginning or at the end, it's a huge red flag. Like, okay, that's definitely a comma error. Now, setting off transitional words and phrases. So if you say something like, however, comma, the bank is closed, you need that comma after however. If you say the bank is, comma, however, comma, closed, you need two commas because this time you buried however, the transitional word, in the middle of the sentence. You also use commas with indirect quotations. But we're not going to discuss the quotations because that's more of an English 1190. Okay, you use it to separate titles or degrees that follow a name. Mary Smith, comma, PhD, period. Separating items and addresses and dates as well. And for those dates and those addresses, you need the comma that follows the date. She wrote the letter, comma, she wrote the letter on January 1, comma, 2013, comma, but it did not get mailed. I need the comma after the 13. Now you also use commas to prevent misreadings, but don't misuse that rule. It has to be followed very carefully. The grammar handbooks explain comma guidelines. There's many websites that also help you with this, and I'm especially recommending Purdue University OWL, okay? And that is something that's very easy to get to if you just Google Purdue University OWL. The apostrophe errors are also very common. A sentence that contains a misplaced or unnecessary apostrophe, or one that doesn't contain an apostrophe that is required. These are a little more straightforward. The dog lost it is collar. That's what that reads, because the correct one would be the dog lost its collar with no apostrophe. Personal pronouns like his and hers and its don't contain the apostrophes. The apostrophes are used for contractions. Its, it apostrophe s, always means it is. It's a good idea to read that it apostrophe s as it is, because you'll point out your errors to yourself. The dog lost it is collar. Just train yourself to do that. And apostrophes are used in a variety of ways. However, the two most common are to show possession and to have to show where you omitted the letters in contractions. So do not becomes do in apostrophe T. Can't is C-A-N apostrophe T, and cannot is actually one word. Don't ask me why, but it is. Now the apostrophe rules. One girl's coat, apostrophe S. Two girls' coats, S apostrophe. So notice that. However, if you have a group noun like children's coats, it's in apostrophe S. And those rules are pretty good about 95% of the time. And again, I'm sending you to the Purdue University OWL. Semicolon errors. It's where you have one that should be there and it isn't, or it's one that the opposite, that you didn't need it but you put it in. Now the car is red, semicolon, but it can't be sold. That's an error. The car is red, semicolon, however, comma, it can't be sold. Now, one way to fix this sentence is to use the conjunctive adverb however. You could even say the car is red, semicolon, it can't be sold. But remember what I said about semicolons. The tendency is to consider them to be very formal and don't use them to connect sentences in the workplace. It just isn't done. Now, memorize the conjunctions. I actually learned this from a student when I first came to Macomb about 15 years ago. If you take the 7 conjunctions, the first letter, it spells out fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So those are the conjunctions. They're different from the conjunctive adverbs. That's why you need to know there's different rules. However is a conjunctive adverb, and you punctuate it differently than you would for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Check the grammar book if you're having trouble with that. Conjunctive adverbs are things like however, furthermore, and therefore. However means but, furthermore means in addition, and therefore means so. Semicolons. One common use of a semicolon is to combine 2 complete sentences that are logically connected in some way. Don't do this with informal or workplace writing. Another use, though, and this can be used anytime, is to separate the items in a series when they already have commas in them. I lived in Detroit, Michigan, semicolon, Chicago, Illinois, semicolon, and New York, period. Do you see how that's easier to read? So that's a good rule to remember. It also works with the dates. It works with any kind of list. Sometimes people confuse semicolons, that's the period below, the period above the comma, with the colon, the period and the period stacked up. Now, semicolons are more like, the comma. It's there, obviously. Colons are more like a full period. And you can use this colon to mean as follows in a list, but don't do it in the middle of a sentence. If you are starting a list, you usually start that list on the next line if you have the colon. You can use a colon to introduce a phrase or a complete sentence. These books should be purchased, Elements of Argument and the Wadsworth Guide. Colons are also used to separate 2 parts of a title, Writing in School, A Study in Communication. Don't overuse those colons. Now, capitalization errors. Obviously, capitalizing when you shouldn't or failing to capitalize when you should. This one, I passed my English exam, but I'm not sure about math. 2 errors. Anything to do with England is a proper noun, so you capitalize it. That's not true about math. However, if you have a specific course like Math 101, that becomes a proper noun. So review your capitalization if you're having trouble. Here are some other reasons to capitalize a word. Obviously, the first word of a sentence, people's names, names of particular structures, special events, monuments, things like that, places and geographical regions like East and West, days of the week, months and holidays, historical periods and documents like the Great Depression and the Declaration of Independence, races and ethnic origins and religions. Now, here's something I want to pull out. I write a lot of text messages. That's wrong. I write a lot of text messages. Always capitalize the personal pronoun I. Quotation marks, they're a little tricky. Dialogue and directly copied words from a source have quotation marks. Titles of shorter works, like short articles, songs, those get quotation marks. Periods and commas go inside the quotation mark. Colons and semicolons go outside. Now here's another hint. You need to know this for one of the questions on the exam. So let me say that again. Periods and commas go inside the quotation marks. Almost always. There's a few rare exceptions. Periods and commas go inside the quotation marks. Colons and semicolons go outside. Now, reviewing the grammar, you can use flashcards. You can go to www.macomb.edu, click on Learning Center, click on the section for English. There's many good websites, but I will tell you the very best is the Purdue University OWL. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always ask me.